What we are going to talk today is about what happened after the Sunday when the stone was rolled away. On Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, and now, as Doug said, we are 3 weeks out, I think 21 days from Easter Sunday. And sometimes in our Christian calendar and our preaching, we tend to jump from Easter to Pentecost immediately. And I'd like to linger today in the post-resurrection time. As you know, Jesus's public ministry lasted roughly 3 years, and he then spent 3 days dead in the tomb, and then he resurrected. The resurrected Jesus then remained on earth for 40 more days before ascending into heaven. The 4 Gospels and Acts record a number of appearances of the resurrected Christ, and you're probably familiar with those stories. We just read one from Luke, but I will be referring to a couple of others too. So we have the accounts of Jesus with the women at the tomb immediately post-resurrection on that Sunday. Then we have the 2 on the road to Emmaus. We have 11 disciples who saw Christ on a couple of different occasions. Then Jesus met several of his fishermen disciples at the Sea of Galilee, which is when Peter was restored after his triple denial. Paul tells us that the resurrected Christ at one time appeared to 500 of his disciples. According to the witness of Scripture, Jesus spent those 40 post-resurrection days exclusively with those who were already his disciples. We don't have any stories of Jesus and unbelievers. Only his disciples had the privilege to engage with the resurrected Christ, which is, of course, in sharp contrast to his earlier ministry, which was directed at all people. So what is the purpose of this extended post-resurrection stay? As I was studying all those appearances, I was struck with how harmonized the witness of Scripture is. All of these stories have similar themes. And in order to highlight those themes, I'm going to be using 4 different questions, 3 asked by Jesus and 1 by an angel. And I think that through these questions, Jesus is addressing some of the most prominent, most persistent struggles of all of his disciples through all time. The first question that Jesus asks is, why are you frightened? And I think Julia will share the PowerPoint. Our text says that when they saw Christ, the disciples were startled and terrified. Their response to seeing the risen Christ is basically sheer terror. Why so fearful? Have you ever heard that story? Remember hearing that story? We're going on a bear hunt. It's a children's book. We're going on a bear hunt. We're gonna catch a big one. We're not scared. It's a beautiful day. And then you go hunting, remember, through different terrains, through grass. And the refrain is, we can't go over it, we can't go under it, we have to go through it. You go through mud, river, forest, cave. Tiptoe, tiptoe, what is that? 2 big googly eyes. Oh no, it's a bear. Quick, what do you do then? Back through the cave, through all the different terrains, run back downstairs, shut the door to the bedroom, jump into the bed, pull up the screen. We are never going on a bear hunt again. The disciples sort of went on a Messiah hunt, and it was going pretty well. Here he is, feeding the thousands, miraculous healings, great fishing, full nets, walking on water. But then it gets darker, and he speaks of suffering. And he dies, and they bury him. And then the person they just buried walks in, and he's got these holes in his hands, and I think I see holes in his feet. And is that a pierced side? Weird and scary stuff. We were in over our heads, they think, probably. We're never going on a Messiah hunt again because God scares them. What God asks of them to see, to bear, to understand, simply terrifies them. Did you know that Christ has to say, "Don't be afraid," 21 times in the Gospels and Acts, recognizing that humans are timid and that they often experience fear and, yes, even terror. If you were asked to catalog your fears, just the ones you experienced this weekend, what would they be? Fear of the virus, fear of unknown, fear that you're unloved, that you're wasting your life, fear of loneliness, perhaps, fear for your children's or your parents' safety, fear of uncertain future. And that's not even getting into God-related fears, right? Perhaps fear that you are not among the elect, fear of misunderstanding scriptures in a big way, fear of the consequences of your spiritual search, fear that prevents us from committing to God fully because honestly, yes, he is scary too. The first thing Jesus says when he enters that room is, "Peace be with you," stating that his resurrected presence ushers in peace and not fear. Listen to what the resurrected Christ said to John when he appeared to him, as recorded in Revelation. "Do not be afraid. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I'm alive forever and ever. I hold the keys of death." The tomb of the greatest terror, death, is empty, and he unlocked it. In those 40 days, the initially scary resurrection becomes instead the foundation of the disciples' peace. What difference does Christ's resurrection make for our own fears today? Has Christ's presence resulted in a gradual decrease of fears in your life? To be honest with you, that's one of the biggest battles of my life. For those of us who live with acute daily anxieties and fears, this is real. It's the resurrected Christ holding the keys against terror every day. Christians, I think that this text tells us not to despair if fears and terror grab us at times. Jesus doesn't speak condemnation on them or you. He speaks comfort and tender reassurances instead, reminding of his victorious power. Because if you remember, as Pastor Devon preached a few Easters ago, the empty tomb has demonstrated once and for all that Jesus will never let the worst thing be the last thing. I don't have any big words today, no big word alerts, but let's have some big historical questions. How about Martin Luther's commentary on 2 Corinthians from the 16th century? This is what he says about the topic of resurrection and fear. "We must not let death and other misfortune, distress and misery terrify us so, because Christ came forth alive from the grave in which he lay, and destroyed and consumed both devil and death. He tore the devil's belly and hell's jaw asunder. Therefore, let the devil rage with his poisonous darts in our conscience. and let him afflict us with all sorts of trouble. Against all of this, our own defiant boast shall be that Christ is our first fruits, that he has initiated the resurrection, that he has burst through the devil's kingdom, and that he no longer dies or sleeps, but rules and reigns up above eternally, in order to rescue us too from this prison of fear and death. I think that's just so beautifully put. So fear came coupled with doubt in the disciples' initial experience of the resurrection. So Jesus asked his second question: why do doubts arise in your hearts? The text says that they were not only startled and terrified, but also thought that they had seen a ghost. Jesus had pulled the greatest escape ever. They could not believe it. Of course, even more familiar account about doubt is the story of Thomas in John 20. I've always loved this poem about Thomas, as it describes the nature of doubt so well. It's our experience of the physical world in juxtaposition to supernatural. These things did Thomas count as real: the warmth of blood, the chill of steel, the grain of wood, the heft of stone, the last frail twitch of flesh and bone. The vision of his skeptic mind was keen enough to make him blind to any unexpected act too large for his small world of fact. His reasoned certainties denied that one could live when one had died, until his fingers read like braille the markings of the spear and nail. Like Thomas, the disciples in Luke's story are at the same time questioning their own sanity and doubting God's power to manipulate the world in such significant ways. The phrase used here in our story in Luke that Neil read was, while in their joy, they were disbelieving and still wondering. I love that. It's kind of, the first Easter is so real. It's kind of a cautious joy. While in their joy, they were disbelieving and still wondering. Here's how Jesus attempts to disperse the doubts of his disciples during those 40 days. First, he demonstrates for them repeatedly the properties of this new body by walking through the walls, for example. He offers plenty of proof that this indeed is him and not a ghost. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus eats and drinks a lot and often. Sort of like, I'm comparing it to Brad Pitt's character in Ocean's 11. If you remember, in every scene, Brad Pitt is eating something. Go reread Luke. Jesus eats so much with people alone in different contexts. And so this resurrected Jesus continues in that vein. Have you got anything to eat? He asks. I'm convinced that this was another way for Jesus to authenticate himself for his friends. Perhaps they said, hey, it really is him. He's hungry again, and he wants the fish prepared just the way he likes it. And so the resurrected Jesus enjoys himself a good bite of broiled fish, at least one whole dinner at Emmaus, and one tasty breakfast that he himself prepares at the shore of the Sea of Galilee. What do you think when you read all this? I have lots of questions, but not a lot of answers. Remember last Sunday we talked about beautiful mysteries. Did he sleep? Was his resurrected body ever cold? How come he ate? What about his digestive system? Perhaps the most puzzling question is, why are there still wounds on his now perfected, resurrected body? Don't they belong to the old earthly body? I found some really interesting answers to that question from another big historical Christian for today. So here is Venerable Bede. Listen to these answers. Jesus kept his scars not from inability to heal them, but to wear them as an everlasting trophy of his victory. They were no longer the signs of deformity, but dignity. Jesus kept his wounds so that when he pleads for us with the Father, he may always show the painful manner of death he endured for us. Isn't that beautiful? The Bible tells of 7 other people who were brought back to life from the dead, but each of them died at the end of their second term. By the time the 40 days were over, Jesus' disciples had seen sufficient proof to believe that this Jesus' body would live forever, would never decay, because death simply had no power over him. Now, the second way he counters their doubts is by teaching them how it all made sense, that he would stand before them alive again. Our text says that he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. Wait. Hasn't he done that already? Is this new material? No, we've covered this many times before. But behold a teacher who does not give up on his students. The phrase, again, Jesus, is used at least a dozen times in the New Testament. Do you not know that Christ had to suffer? He asks the 2 on the road to Emmaus. Let me tell you again then. Do you not know that God can raise me and you from the dead? Let me tell you again. That's why he stayed behind for 40 more days, so that the doubting disciples would finally experience what they describe as a really intense burning of their hearts. Jesus does not stop teaching until they get it, until their hearts burn with greater understanding and confidence in God's power to defeat death. A word about doubt here. Everybody doubts. Don't doubt that. Yes, even the PhDs, even the reverends. Don't despair when your faith is rocked by moments or seasons of doubts. Obviously, you will not get to verify things with your own fingers like Thomas. But here is the good news. Jesus recognizes that your position of coming to belief is harder, so he's cutting you some slack. When dealing with Thomas, Jesus declares, "Blessed are those who haven't seen, and yet they believe." That is you. The resurrected Jesus pronounced a blessing on you. During those intimate 40 days with his followers, Jesus thought of you also. And he's more than willing to work with you. The resurrected Christ will never throw his hands up in the air and declare you hopelessly unteachable because of your doubts. Are you in need of clarification of God's plan for your life? Are you still not sure that this book makes any sense? Are you scared of death and find yourself doubting afterlife? These 40 days show us that Jesus will never quit until you have confidence again, that his Spirit will convince you over and over again. And then there came a time to talk about distractions, our third question. If you recall, in the Gospel of John, after the resurrection, Peter was in the middle of a very important conversation with Jesus. he was being restored and then charged with feeding Jesus' sheep. Remember? When Peter interrupted with seemingly something of far greater importance, excuse me, Lord, but Lord, excuse me, this is urgent. Here goes that disciple that you love so much. What about him, John? Peter struggled accepting the charge because he was very distracted. John was Peter's distraction. Of course, we are no different. Many distractions in general keep us from focusing on Jesus. But let's talk about spiritual distractions in particular. Peter, I feel you. I look around. Who does what for God? Is that better or worse than I'm doing? Are they holier than I am? How many hours does she spend serving the needy? Judging by their Facebook posts, they look like they enjoy a closer walk with God than me. How does my devotion compare? Is Jesus fulfilling more of their dreams and prayers than mine? Is it just me? Before I can commit to Jesus, I, like Peter, need to know who else is doing what for Christ and how I measure up. I must be made privy to everybody else's deal with Jesus. And frankly, that takes time and energy, which simply does not leave me with much of either to actually focus on Christ. The resurrected Christ responds, "What is it to you? You follow me." Remember the finger on that painting pointing? You follow me, and never you mind what I'm doing in the lives of those around you. Plus, it's unproductive and paralyzing for your discipleship. One of my favorite quotes from all church history comes from Jonathan Edwards. And if you need inspiration for your next New Year's resolution, he wrote 70 of these resolutions. Resolved, he says, that all people should live for the glory of God. Resolved second, that whether others do or not, I will. That's another big theologian, big Christian figure for you today. So the resurrected Jesus responded to disciples' fears and doubts. He confronted them on their distractions with a firm rebuke. The fourth and the last thing that all appearances have in common is that on every occasion when Jesus meets his disciples, he sort of empties a whole bag of verbs in front of his disciples. Go, teach, witness, proclaim, tell, baptize, follow. Our last question comes from an angel addressing his disciples after Jesus' ascension. Why do you stand here looking at the sky? Resurrection is a huge game changer, and your response can't possibly be to remain in one place, in this passive position. Move. The manner by which other people would learn about Jesus' victory over death would be through active personal testimony of his disciples. Peter accepted this. And in Acts 10, he's preaching it. He says Jesus was not seen by all the people, but by witnesses whom God had already chosen, by us who ate and drank, remember Jesus eating and drinking, with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one whom God appointed as judge of the living and the dead. So what we have here at the end of these 40 days, from initially frightened and doubtful, from distracted and passive at first, the personal witness of these 500, after the Spirit was given, convinced the world of the reality of the resurrection, and resulted in you sitting here on this Sunday morning in front of your computers. The call of Jesus still remains a call to active and not to stagnant, inert discipleship. Following definitely requires movement. It's dynamic. And from these appearances stories, we have to conclude that the best indication that you are his follower is that your life, whether in words or deeds, has a strong element of witnessing. Following and witnessing to the resurrected Christ go hand in hand. Jesus chose that the manner by which most people learn about him and his victory over death would be through personal testimony of his disciples who knew him. That still remains true. Do you know Christ, whose presence has relieved your fears? Christ who has beckoned you from doubt to faith time and time again? Do you know Christ who has taught you patiently about life and his plan for you? If you know him, you must speak. Your main calling in life is to be his witness in your time, in your place. I'm gonna have Julia at the end put a slide with a confession that I would like us to read together today. I would like you to read it first for yourself, maybe just take a minute, and see if you can wholeheartedly confess to this. Read it through and see if you can commit to this today after reading and learning about these appearances stories. Okay, let's read it together, shall we? I believe that by dying and rising again, Jesus conquered death. I believe his promise that this, my body, will not perish, but will live forever, resurrected. I believe that Jesus Christ is my peace, and that he has the power to disperse all of my fears. When I am in terror, I will think of the empty tomb and boast in his resurrection. I believe that Jesus will never stop teaching me, no matter how slow I am in understanding, or how much or how often I doubt. I believe that Jesus chose to use me to be his active witness, testifying to his power and grace to those around me. I have resolved that whether others do or not, I will speak of him and serve him gladly. Amen.